Absolutely. Hi, I'm JL Johnson, and you are in the panel garden.
Let's explore creative minds at the panel garden. See what blooms, see what we find at the panel garden. Comics, cartoons, some old and new, nerdy papes, writers, editors, and art. Picking all their minds apart. With evil web as adorable as it gets.
JL, it is awesome to have you on the panel garden. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So I understand you have a just this really interesting project, and what's it about?
Ennead, the Rule of Nine, is what I've come to call my love letter to the epic fantasy genre. I grew up loving epic fantasy, and as a young Black man, despite seeing myself in the genre, I always felt a part of the worlds. I never felt disconnected from them. That being said, when I decided to dive into this project, one of my main goals was to bring my lived experience into the genre. So that's why I say it's my love letter to the genre. I feel like I'm speaking to the fans of the genre who look like me and who don't, who have lived experiences like I do and who do not, but we'll all be able to come together because we understand the love language of epic fantasy. So that, from a high level, that's Ennead, the Rule of Nine. And when you drill it down, you have a jaded soldier. His name is Anatu Kinnisk. He's running from his past. He finds himself in the one place in the world that his countrymen and women won't come looking for him. Unfortunately, that place is about to tailspin into a civil war. And on top of that, magic has been banished to the four corners of the world for a few centuries now. And of course, it's making its way back in. So Anatu is our eyes into this this very, very dark turn in the world of Amashik that's about to take place.
So what inspired you to work on a project like this?
Really, I'd have to go back to my experiences as a child. I, for the better part of my youth, I was an only child. I do have a younger brother now, and I have older siblings, but they're old enough that they were kind of out of the house. So my lived experience was that of an only child. And I remember as a kid spending hours setting up action figures in my bedroom, and I would set them up like episodes in television. So I used to love Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I would set up bad guys and adventures all throughout all throughout my bedroom. And I would start on one end of the room, and we would go through the room like an episode. And so when I think back to those times, and you ask me what inspires me to dive into a project like this, really just touching that part of my youth again. I spent most of my 20s battling some pretty bad bouts with anxiety and depression. And when I came out of that, I recognized that I had gotten away from myself. And one of the first things I got the urge to do coming out of that was script a comic. So I would say the ability to see the world through a child's eyes again is definitely a big inspiration. When you talk about who and what, definitely big epic worlds like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and a more modern and current context, stories like Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive, and just the way that those worlds all feel so lived in is something that I wanted to try my hand at creating.
That's amazing. What is your approach to representation and diversity?
As someone who grew up, luckily, in a place where that was very much my lived experience, it really is thinking back to, once again, my life outside of writing. I am someone who's always wanted to lean in and learn from and push myself to really see things from other people's perspectives. I studied philosophy in university, and I was always about just exploring things that were often misunderstood. And so as I came to be an adult, I recognized more the importance of just where I was lucky enough to be born and how I saw the world. You know, I was always open to seeing new perspectives. I was always open to having friends that didn't look like or feel like or love like I did. I never thought twice. And then, of course, reality smacks you in the face, and you recognize that that's not everybody's experience. So when you ask me what's my approach, realistically, when I picture characters in my head and when I hear voices in my head, and I'm thinking about applying them in my world, they are from diverse groups of people, whether it's sexual orientation or gender identity or race and religion. That really was my experience. So I think I try to stay as authentic as I can, and so that would be one way that I'd answer that. The other way, in terms of just the nuts and the bolts of it all, how I put it together on paper. The characters within Ennead and within the world of Amashik are experiencing a time. I like to liken it to the Tower of Babel story in the Bible. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. We can maybe dabble there. I don't want to offend any biblical scholars because I am not that. but I do know that, basically the idea was, all people at one point in time could speak to one another, and we spoke the same human language. And then I believe it was a very angry and maybe spiteful God at the time, found that we were using that and trying to usurp their place atop the hierarchy. And so the Tower of Babel was destroyed. That's as far as I know it. So imagine the world of Amashik and this event that I know as the separation taking place just after a time like that. So like me, the world of Amashik recognizes its diversity and it honors its diversity, although current events may have shattered and separated peoples and different fantasy races from one another. The world still remembers. And so that's the other way that I would answer that question. And then lastly, when I first wrote the first arc of Ennead, I sent it out to about 7 to 10 folks to read it. These were folks who spanned every spectrum, age, again, the ones that I just mentioned. And I got their feedback. What characters felt flat, what storylines didn't work, who felt like a caricature. And I took that advice to heart, and here we are.
That's awesome. It sounds like a really, just a really exciting world and story. I have to be 100% honest and let you know that I did not read this yet, but I will. It's on my list. Sorry about that.
That is A-okay. I am. I like we mentioned off. Is it off screen here? No, off mic. Backstage, I guess. Sure. I'm all for just exploring genuine conversation. So I appreciate you being transparent. But most of the people that I talk to haven't read Ennead, so you're in good company.
Well, more people should, because it sounds just like a fascinating, if nothing else, just sort of walkthrough of an original concept, which is interesting.
I could speak to that. I don't want to belabor the point, but the world is so much. The world is such a big part of why I'm doing this. So before I ever started scripting it as a comic, which is how it was written originally, that I'm not taking a novel and trying to stuff it into a comic series. This was written as a comic because one of the other things that I always wanted to see was other people's fantasy worlds within the comic book genre. I grew up reading comics and got away from them in my teen years when everyone told me it wasn't cool. And then I got back into adulthood and it was cool again. So I totally followed that crowd. But now here I am back and trying to script them. So I wrote Ennead as a comic first and foremost, but the world of Ennead existed just on its own. So Amashik is what I'm calling it now. I used to play around on a website called World Anvil, which allows you to world build, and you can build cultures, and you can store your maps and all your different factions. And so Amashik existed under another name as a world just for world building's sake. And then when I decided that I was enjoying my time there so much, and I was building out these different, historical events, and I wanted to see people in it, and I wanted to invite people to it. And so I'm very proud of the world that I built. I will say that the world predates the comic by about 4 years. So the world building aspect is definitely probably the easiest to grasp onto when you first dive into the book.
So earlier you were talking about how characters just sort of appear in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Where did those voices come from? And do you put a lot of work into sort of molding them, or do they come out fully formed?
I definitely put a lot of work into molding them. When they come out, I like to think about my characters as people that I'm getting to know. And the editor that I work with, who I'm always hesitant to name on in live arenas like this, just because I haven't asked for permission. But the editor that I work with, they came on board over the summer. And one of the things that they've helped me do in the last few months is really lean into the voices that were becoming. So I had characters pop up. For example, I mentioned Anatu Kinnisk, and I told the story of Ennead as though it's centered around Anatu. Truth be told, Anatu didn't come into the fold until 3 or 4 iterations of Arc 1, after I had kept running into the same problem. I kept getting the same feedback about the story feeling too sporadic, and it was bouncing around too much. So I had to create a central figure. And so if any of my characters kind of just popped into being, it was Anatu, and it was out of pure necessity. The story needed, readers, I felt, needed a clearer entry point into the world, into the story. And so that's where he came from. Other characters, you could say, were always there. There's a character by the name of Queen Ellaria Shadoon, and she is the 3rd generation queen in the Republic Kingdom of Athea, which was founded by her grandmother and 8 other nobles when they penned the Rule of 9. And after seceding from an empire, Athenia Shadoon and 8 other noble houses, they created the Rule of 9, which states, and I'm going somewhere with this, but it states that every 3 generations, the Ennead shall turn over power back to the people, and the people shall choose another 9 houses to lead the next Ennead. So we're in the 3rd generation of that first Ennead, and now it is Queen Ellaria's job to not only finish this war that began when her grandmother made this move. She now has to steward a nation into becoming what it was always meant to be. And so a character like that, although she's one of my favorites, she's less malleable than Anatu, because she inhabits a space in the world that is a bit more fixed and a bit more rigid. She comes from a very powerful, family legacy. And so when I look for inspiration for her, I look to some of my favorite and most powerful monarchs in my fantasy, Rolodex. And so she's a bit Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. And I liken her to Cersei because Cersei, for me, is one of the most rich queens we have in the world of fiction. She's not flat by any means. And so other than that, they don't have too much in common, but I think about her often when I'm writing Queen Ellaria. And so some characters like Queen Ellaria, they are who they are because the story needs them to be that. And although I try to bring life to her, she's definitely not as malleable as someone like Anatu, who really just he you ever hear the phrase like a God-sized hole in your heart? And he had an Anatu-sized hole in it, and he now fills it.
So, just listening to you talk about this, My best assessment is that you're one of those writers that plans a lot. Though this sounds like a really thoughtfully planned world and story.
Thank you. I take that as a big compliment. And yes, which is funny because I said to you before, I don't really prep. And if you were to look at my notebooks when I was in everything from elementary to graduate school, after the first 2 pages, they're blank because in the beginning, again, I'm going somewhere with this. In the beginning, I do a lot of planning. I do a lot of note taking. And once I feel like I have enough underneath me or behind me, I let myself go. And so the notes for Ennead are very, very full. But I haven't added to them in quite some time, if that makes sense. So I have a lot of references for different world events and things like that that I've found interesting over the years that really just make up a nice chunk of the data stored on my computer. And I can dive into that. I have an Ennead folder on my desktop, and then when you go into that folder, there's probably 50 subfolders, and within those you have the notes and the references and the character arcs, and so there are a lot of notes there. But when I sit down to write, because I mentioned I've lived in Amashik in my mind for so long, a lot of it's just there. So I can thankfully speak to some parts of this world's history as though they're real, because to me they are. And so again, that's a huge compliment because it's one of the things that I'm most proud of. I really do feel like I'm crafting a world that feels lived in because I've actually lived in it for so long.
Is it challenging to take a world like that and then, like, involve other people in the collaboration to produce the comic?
It was. It was. In the beginning, it was, I felt uneasy. But I've been working with the same artist. I have asked for permission to always use the artist name. His name is Luke Horsman. And so I've worked with Luke now for about 18 months, I want to say. And Luke and out of those 18 months, other than taking off for holidays and birth of children, I'm pretty sure he and his partner had a baby maybe right before we started. And then my wife and I had a baby 9 months ago. So other than things like that, we've been in constant contact. So I've gotten very used to sharing the creation of Ennead, the Rule of Nine, especially with Luke. And then I've met so many awesome creators along the way who have helped me craft this world. And so I feel like they're very much a part of the world and the team. But in the beginning, I was hesitant. I was nervous because, again, I'd spent so much time here. And so when I mentioned, in a script, and a line in the script that Anatu is, walking down a street in the city of Dunport, and, he stops at a bread stand because why not? I love bread and I can do that.
Bread is delicious.
Right. I imagined a very particular loaf of bread when I wrote that. And every time I read that line in the script before it came to life, I imagined what that bread smelled like. And I'm very much, I describe a lot of food in the first few issues. You'll see that. I did that and I read those lines for months and months and months. So when an artist gives you that back, you almost look, you cover one eye and you half squint the other eye because you don't want to see it and it not be what you thought you were going to see. But over time, I've recognized that that's the fun part as a comic writer. You do get to share in this experience. So I went from being timid and nervous and afraid that I might not, and I'm putting up air quotes here, get what I want. But I recognize that that's definitely what makes the medium special. So the scene that we're working on right now in book 7 is one of the earliest scenes. It was one of the first scenes that I wrote Anatu into. And it's a bit of a battle fight sequence. There's not a lot of that, despite it being an epic fantasy comic. I'm trying hard to build a world out in an interesting way before I just start cutting people's heads off. But this was one of the first fights. And hopefully I can convey a lot about the two characters who are going back and forth through this fight. But seeing it come to life right now is one of the most fulfilling things. And I think had this been one of the first scenes that was illustrated or drawn, I don't think I would be as excited about it because I would have had too many. I would have been holding it too tightly. I've learned to let my script go and let it be what it's going to be in the mind of the artist.
So we talked a lot about sort of the world and the characters, but how do you write a compelling comic book story?
I feel compelled to say that I hope that I'm actually doing that. Right. I'm right now. I would say that there are probably 200 to 300 people in the world who've at least have a chance to read Ennead. They've purchased a copy in some manner. So I'm still very early on in the process. So, well, I'll assume that that's actually what I'm doing as I answer this question. Again, it goes back to the love language of epic fantasy, and so in some parts, I know what I've always expected from the story of my fantasy dreams. You know, I knew what kind of characters I wanted to see. I knew what type of political intrigue would interest me most. I knew just the right amount of fights and large scale battles that would keep me coming back. I'm writing for that kid. I'm writing for that young man. I'm writing for that father who's going to hopefully introduce their child to this world and this genre. And so I'm in a way, I'm selfishly just writing the story that makes me excited to write. So that's one way that I would answer that. Another way, it goes back to the world. And I know you mentioned that we've talked about the world, but the world has some dilemmas in it. And one of them, I mentioned the rule of 9 as a philosophy major back from when I was in undergrad. I used to love political philosophy. And so studying political philosophy really is just a bunch of, hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying this, young people just sitting around right after they've smoked a lot of weed outside of the campus bounds, running back in to go postulate about a bunch of nonsense, right? So that's really what college was for me. And but luckily, I also learned a thing or two. And political philosophy always used to intrigue me because you would always have these big what ifs, and you would eventually create this idyllic way that the world should be. And really the Republic Kingdom of Athea is just one of those ideas that I used to toss around all the time. And the rule of 9, although I hope is a novel political idea when you are introduced to it, it was always my go-to when I was asked, well, what would your perfect, government look like? And it would be some type of a representative democracy that had the checks and balances among people who had the best interest in mind, and kind of like what we're supposed to have here in the States, but with a smaller number of people, less likely to be corrupt because there were term limits. So really what I did when I wrote this story was took all these things that have intrigued me over the years, not stuffed them into a fantasy costume, because I don't want to. It's deeper than that, and I would hope that it's more meaningful that when you read it. But that's really what I'm doing. I'm taking a lot of conversations that I've had with friends, that I've had with loved ones, that I've had with myself, and I've filtered them through these characters. And so that's to go back to a question you asked earlier. How do I allow my character? How do I find the voices of my characters? There's a character in my story. They have a bit of a big role to play, and their name is Niawi of the Order of the Jade Crest. And Niawi is a psionic elf, is the easiest way to describe Niawi, and they are very old, and they've been around and they've seen some things, but they're by no means a godlike character. They're the idea of gods in Amashik are a bit fluid, and I'll just say that. But Niawi is godlike for sure. And what I get to do when I am telling their bits of the story is I get to play with ideas about time and existence and all the existential stuff. So I can do the political philosophy through the rule of nine and that political intrigue. I can do the existential philosophy through Niawi. And then I can do really the moral philosophy that I've always enjoyed through the eyes of Anatu and King Julius and Lady Gideon and Dofoli, all these characters that inhabit different parts of Amashik. And they're almost on the ground in the middle of it all. And they get to make choices, and we get to agree or disagree with those choices. And so that's what makes it so fun for me to write. And that's why I've spent so much time here, because again, selfishly, I think I'm just writing for the fantasy fan in me.
Nice. So mechanically, when you sit down and you get ready to write, what happens? Do you have a ritual, something you do to get in the zone?
Other than putting on particular music, no. And so depending on my mood, I'm either listening to a lo-fi Star Wars playlist on Spotify, or I'm listening to one of the Game of Thrones soundtracks when I write. And depending on my mood, if I'm in an upbeat mood, I go for the Star Wars lo-fi. If I'm in a more anything that isn't upbeat, I go for the Game of Thrones. Other than that, I don't really have any rituals around writing. But mechanically, what tends to happen is I go back and I read the last thing that I wrote. I used to be an elementary school teacher for a little while. And one of the things that I would do when I wrote a lesson plan is I would like to leave myself what I called hooks. And these hooks were things that I would embed in the lesson so that when I read it again or when I saw it again, I would know exactly what I meant. And mechanically, I write with a lot of hooks, more so for me than the audience. These are things that you might not pick up when you read my stories, but there's certainly things that I leave for myself. So it could be a turn of phrase. It could be the way I describe a scene. It could be, a character death, whatever it is. There are these things that I know I'm immediately going to be brought right back into the story. And so mechanically, I go back and I read until I catch a hook or get caught on a hook. And then I'm hopefully pulled back to where I was. And other than those two things, especially now, this side of parenthood and trying to just squeeze in any writing where I can, I definitely don't have any other rituals.
Do you write in order, or do you just pick out pieces in different places at different times?
There is I definitely do not write in order. There are certain events in the story that happen concurrently. I'm trying not to do much I'm blanking. Flashbacks in the story. There aren't many flashbacks. Technically, there's one, but it's also happening concurrently and in more of like a vision almost. So I try to tell the story from where we are forward. But I am telling stories currently across 3 countries and 2 continents. So in the world of Amashik. And So no, I don't always write in order because but I do have like a almost like a key of sorts. So depending on, I have a timeline in my story, and when I first crafted it, I put things neatly. Everybody started in a particular time and place within my writing process, and so depending on the events that are going on, for example, if you get on a boat. I did way too much research on, maritime travel and, ancient and medieval cultures. And there's some really cool things online that you can find that are interactive and will tell you how the seasons change and what happens while you're on the ocean. The season change, all these really weird things that I found when I was researching this story. So I'll use that from time to time to help center myself around the main story that I'm trying to tell. But still, that's not me writing in order. But I do have a fixed timeline that I have to reorganize all the writing around once it's on paper.
Is there a particular emotional place, a resonance that you used to create with?
Yes. So I go back to one of the things that I said earlier on. Before, so I actually mentioned I was an elementary school teacher, and during that time, I realized, while also going to therapy, but through the work that I was doing, I realized that my therapist at the time referred to it as I had unsettled some sediment at the bottom of my subconscious mind. Imagine like a fish tank, and you just run your hand along the bits of gravel or whatever it is at the bottom of a fish tank. He would describe it way more eloquently, but you just imagine running your hands through it and then watching that stuff kind of float through the water. What I recognized when I was teaching was that I grew up feeling like I wasn't seen. And I had a very loving and attentive family, but not everybody always saw me for who I saw myself for. I like to say I walked around with a cardboard version of myself. And that was what I presented to the world for a long time. And so when you ask me about the emotional place that I write from when I write, it's very much going back and trying to create space for Jeffrey to be seen. I know I refer to myself as JL, but for Jeffrey to be seen, for who I really am, to be free to express themselves. So it's very much, it's hard to put an emotional label on it, but that's the space, wanting to be seen and wanting to be seen for who I really am is certainly the easiest way to describe or to answer that question.
It's interesting that you have a background as a teacher. I imagine that would make you a very effective storyteller because you're used to sort of capturing people's attention and conveying ideas that way.
It does feel natural to me. I currently am a fitness coach, and I do a lot. I do group training, I do personal training, and so that is still very much a part of what I do in the fabric of who I am day in and day out. And again, I appreciate that. It's one of those things that if you looked back though on who I used to be, I certainly was not that person. And so that, again, I think that even just the act of writing and the act of sharing my story with the world is, although it's not new to me because I've been doing it for so long, it still feels so fresh. It still feels exciting because it's this is how I always wanted to present myself to the world. But I learned through conditioning that this wasn't who I was supposed to be at a young age. And again, I don't want, we all have our stories, right? And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I think what I've learned and what just chronologically will probably be the first third, hopefully, of my story, is that showing up in the world in a way that makes sense, in a way that feels fulfilling, in a way that feels, in a way that brings you joy is the best way to do it. And so storytelling has really become that for me. And when I started teaching, I don't think I would have described teaching as storytelling, but I do think, and I'm not sure that I've ever described teaching as storytelling, but you nailed it 100%. If I may say, this is one why I like going into these conversations without knowing much, because by you saying that, if you could see me now, I'm looking all over the room. My eyes are up because you just opened up a channel in my mind that I never thought of myself as a storyteller way back then. so even as I began the journey of trying to find who I really wanted to be, which going into teaching was very much a part of, I didn't know I was trying to give space to the storyteller in me. I thought I was doing something else. And so, yeah, what you just said there is very, very powerful for me personally. And I'm getting a bit emotional just because I have these moments in time where I feel like I can feel literal spaces just opening up in my mind. And you referring to teaching and storytelling is definitely doing that for me. So thank you.
Awesome. So one thing I wonder as a writer who's never actually finished anything is
Technically, I'm not either.
is there a trick to starting a project, seeing it through, and getting to the point where it's published?
Is there a trick?
Is there a process, just something special you do about it?
I don't want to use the word struggling, but that's a tough one to answer because I still think I'm in that process, and I guess that is in and of itself the answer. I had to just put it out there. I had to, and I know this is what a lot of people say when they get this question, but I'm just going to answer it, as honestly as I can. I am still in my own mind not finished and at a point where I'm still working to continue to introduce this story to folks. So, man, that's a tough one. I think if I can go back and put myself where I was mentally when I first reached out to the few artists that I did to start bringing these characters to life, I go back to wanting to meet them, and I go back to wanting to get to know them and wanting to see them and wanting them to see the city of Dunport and wanting them to go to Evermore Castle. And so it was from this place of curiosity, I guess. And I'm still curious. I'm still curious about how this story is going to unfold. And I have the major mile markers in the story. I know where the story ends for a lot of these characters, and I know where a lot of the conflicts will end up. And I know where some of these factions will see an increase and decrease in power and all of these different things. But I'm still so curious about it all, even though it's coming from me. Because once I put it out there and it's on the screen in front of me, scripted and written out, I get a fresh opportunity to perceive it a little bit differently. I can put it down and come back with everything somewhat collected and in order. And then I can send it to the editor I work with, and they can send it back to me with a few suggestions. I can tinker it again. And then when I read it again, I get a new experience. And then I send it to the artist, and then I get the rough sketches, and I get to experience it again. So I think the answer to that is how continuing to find ways to be curious and excited about my own world and my own story, because I'm very much telling this for me still. I think that's got to be the answer.
Nice. So you've got your book out. It's available physically as a paper series, but it's also being sold digitally. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what I'm curious about is, does the process, or rather the existence of digital distribution, change the production style or the things you do to get your book out?
Just let me ask a follow-up. Do you mean the means of distribution? Do you mean the actual mechanics of the creation? Are you referring to timeline? Tell me more.
I was just wondering, sort of broadly, say, like, for example, digital distribution didn't exist for the book. Would you do things differently in that world than you do in this one?
It's a good question. It's something I think I came into a space where it was very much the reality that I always knew it would be distributed digitally. So I don't know that I've actually thought about that on the fly. I think the answer would be no. I don't think it would change I don't think it would change anything, because so much of what I mentioned this before, but so much of pretty much all of Ennead, the Rule of Nine, um, came from a world that I had built, which came to be known as Amashik, which then I knew I wanted to uh, put characters in and tell stories in. And when I made that decision, I always knew I wanted it to be a comic. And so I guess I would have to go back to that point in time. And at that point in time, yeah, I guess I still knew digital would always be a part of it. That's a good question, because I think that if I weren't so much involved in the world, the digitized world, because there are plenty of people, I guess I could try to tackle it this way. There are plenty of people who have zero interest in digital comics. And so when you think about something like a web comic that's kind of scrolls top to bottom, I think that might be the experience that those folks are used to. And so that might be what turns them off about digital comics, because they always think web comics. But I guess in my mind's eye was always going to be in book form. And so I always imagined it in the, even though I wanted it to be a comic, I always imagined it like, a Game of Thrones or a Feast of Crows, like a book on somebody's shelf that when they took it down, they were going to Westeros or Amashik, and they were going to this place that they could spend hours in. So yeah, it's a great question, and I know I keep saying that because another thing that I never really thought about, but I knew I wanted it to be a comic, and so I guess the yes or no to that is no. I don't think it would have changed anything, because by that time, digital comics were already something that I was reading. They were already something I was experiencing and was familiar with.
Can you think of a comic book that formed you as a person, or rather, maybe informed the way you see the world?
That's informed the way I see the world, and definitely impacted or informed me as a comic book writer. I think those would be different directions. I think I would have to credit the Walking Dead for getting me back into comics as an adult. So in terms of a comic writer, the scope that the scope that I still to this day imagine Ennead, the Rule of Nine to be is very much in that Walking Dead scope of, hitting that issue 50 milestone, hitting that issue 100 milestone, 150. Those are things that I believe I have enough story. The question will be, can I garner enough interest to do that? But so that's one answer to that question. In terms of comics that inform the way I see the world, I look at a lot of and this will be somewhat of a cop out, but I look at a lot of just the superhero genre, and that's what is synonymous with comics for most people. And I think back to an essay that I wrote when I was in college, and it was about the need for superheroes and villains in pop culture, and why a society like ours needed that. And just to paint the picture here, I'm in an office where there's probably maybe a 3-foot model Superman in the corner. And so Superman is watching me while I answer this. But, Superman was one of those characters for me. And growing up, just this idyllic version of the everyman, who we all wanted to be, but never thought we could, until we got to see how Clark Kent really saw himself. And he didn't see himself as the man with the red cape. He saw himself as the man in love with Lois. And so, but too shy to speak to her, by the way. And she's too shy to tell her. So I think about things like that, and why comics and superheroes are still so important to us, and why they bring some of the best and worst out of us as they grow in popularity and scale these days. But I think superheroes and having heroes as a kid who often didn't see himself um, as himself, and often found himself imagining another persona that would allow him to fill bigger shoes and play a bigger role and be seen. I think that would be, you could put that on any superhero, but again, Superman is watching me. And I remember as a kid, Superman being really, really important for me. I also was as a young kid, I was way more into the DC world. And as an adult, I think I'm leaning more Marvel. I don't do much big two stuff at this moment in time, but if I had to throw my hat in that ring, that's how I would do that. I would split it. Before The Walking Dead, I was way more DC characters, way more Superman and Batman, and post Walking Dead, I'm way more X-Men.
Nice. Good choices. Do you still have time to read comics?
Yes, I actually do. It is often the only thing that I have time to physically read. I do audiobooks for everything else. So,
They're convenient.
yeah, I can sit down and while, watching a baby monitor during a nap, I can usually get through a 30-page, 20-page comic. I have a lot of Kickstarter and indie created books that are on my to be read list right now. I had been reading The House of X on, I don't remember Marvel's app, but on that app for a while. So I do read digital comics still. I read physical comics from the indie folks, but definitely I have some time here and there. I just finished the first 4 issues or 3 issues of Berserker, whichever are out. So that's, is that indie? Is it not? I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, but that's a book that I very recently finished. And so I'm definitely still getting them in.
Do you remember the first comic that made you cry?
I can't say that I remember. I can't say that I remember the first because I don't want to assume that it was the first. But definitely as the first in this re-entry into comics, which was about 10 or 12 years ago, whenever The Walking Dead started hitting the shelves. That was definite. I can remember the first time The Walking Dead made me cry.
Nice.
Made me cry a few times. So yes, it was definitely The Walking Dead. And I don't know, is it spoilery to talk about a 10-year-old storyline in The Walking Dead? But
I don't think so.
when Lori meets her end in the comic, that one was tough for me. And I remember being taken back so much by just almost the not nonchalant, but very quick way that she met her end. And I won't spoil it completely. And who she also met her end with, that hit me hard. Because I wasn't expecting to see that. That broke so many rules. And then again, when Glenn met his demise, that one, I think, like most of us who read that before we saw it, that was another one that just rocked me. And so those are 2 of the biggest that I can just offhand remember where I was and how I reacted when I read them.
So is there anyone that sticks out in your mind as the single most inspiring creator in comics?
The short answer to that is going to be no. And again, I think I'd have to look away from the bigger publishing houses and look at my contemporaries right now, who are trying to get their own IPs off the ground. I'd have to say collectively, all of them, all of us, because whenever I get an opportunity to speak to another creator who I feel is very much like me, someone who, whether it's lifelong love of comics or off again, on again love of comics, who just ultimately wanted to tell their own stories using this medium. One of the things that I think I always am taken back by is how they fit it in, how they get it done. And everybody's got their own unique set of circumstances, but from creators who are working full-time jobs and being, as very as present as they can be as parents and loved ones and partners and who write comics and script comics in the dead of night and this isn't to take away from the creators at the bigger houses who probably, and I'm almost certain, are doing similar things. To know that there might only be 100 people who ever read your 10-part series, but you're still going to bring it to life with the same passion, the same love, the same respect for storytelling. And despite the fact that, again, it might just be you and a handful of others who ever get to experience it, there's something that always pushes me not towards jealousy or envy when one of those folks has what I perceive to be more flushed out or more robust audience. It inspires me to keep going. It inspires me that this person who's working in their own little corner of the universe that may never really be heard is still finding value in what they're writing and what they're drawing and what they're creating. So I would have to say it's you can loosely call us Kickstarter comic creators, and I would say that faction of people has definitely inspired me the most, especially over the last 18 to 24 months.
Well, JL, we are up against the end of our show. Are you ready for the fun part?
Absolutely.
So earlier you mentioned you are a huge Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan.
Yes.
But is there a particular turtle that you see yourself as?
Donatello.
Nice.
Always.
I've always been more of a Michelangelo, I think.
Yeah, my cousins and I, we would all we all had our own turtle. There were four of us, and Donatello was always it for me.
Nice. So if you had a Batman style utility belt, but it was made of things that were relevant to your life, what would be in it?
Right now, a baby monitor, a teething toy, my cell phone opened up to my ESPN fantasy football app at all times. Definitely some type of carb, whether it's a bread product or a potato chip of some kind. And let's say one more. And some dog treats because I love Ruth, my 70-pound lab.
What inspires you?
Possibility. I go back to my my time studying philosophy, and that I think is really where a lot of the creative juices that I can imagine I always wanted to tap into, but was never really given space to tap into. That's really where they started to flow, and that all began with, hey, in this space, we are kind of safe to explore things that are out of bounds. We're safe to explore things that go against the rules, that buck the trend. And so I had a particular professor who, when I met him, his name is Dr. Michael Kogan. I reference him as often as I can. I took a class of his. It was a semester-long study on Martin Buber, and who's a Jewish scholar. And I remember stepping into this class with Dr. Kogan, who himself was a Jewish scholar, and I didn't know what to expect. And in that course, he opened up my eyes to a way of seeing the world that I was always fairly close to. I grew up in a Christian household, and so the Judeo-Christian faiths are very, very similar, and they have similar roots, et cetera, et cetera. But he was the first person who just kind of cracked the door open to a different way of viewing a lot of the same principles and events and times. And so I think the way he did that intrigued me. And so I kept taking classes by Dr. Kogan, and it became very much a theme of the scholars that he focused his classes on. And by the end of my time in university, I realized, and I actually have it tattooed on me, that the human existence is what I've come to know as, and this is through another one of those philosophers by the name of Martin Heidegger. The human experience is thrown potentiality or thrown possibility, meaning half of our existence is thrown. We don't get to choose our parents. We didn't get to choose the era we were born into. There are a lot of parts of who we are that just are. And I think that the time that we're in here in the United States of America, there are a lot of people who are fighting to be who they are in a way that I don't think we ever really have before. And I think it's pushing us. And I think it's one of the reasons why we get so much, we're getting so much upheaval and uproar, because there's a lot of folks who are saying no more, enough is enough. This is who I am. And then beyond that, the possibility or the potentiality to take who you are and then become whatever it is you want to become is, again, something that so much of us are fighting for in new ways and in bolder ways and more public ways. And so whether that's, what I'm trying to do as someone who's trying to become a writer, or something much deeper than that, someone trying to live life, and again, I mentioned this early on, love who they want to love and represent themselves so they want to represent themselves and express themselves, and do all of these things that we were told we couldn't do. So when you ask what inspires me most, it's just the possibility that comes with living a life on this rock that we live on. Especially where we live, there's so many things that we can't change, but right on the flip side of that, it's just possibility. And that's not to paint a broad brush and try to get away from all the things that are wrong with the world, that prevent so many of us from being able to lean into that possibility. But just the dreams and the hopes of that possibility has done so much for us. And so I like to look to that and use that for inspiration.
Do you have a favorite food? French
fries. That's easy.
What criteria do you look for when you pick minions?
When you say that, I picture little yellow guys from Despicable Me. So I would say, if I was picking those, definitely loyalty. You can't choose another supervillain other than me when it suits you. But you got to be able to make me laugh, because I can be a bit emotional at times, and laughter is the easiest way to pull me out of that.
Where do you find joy?
Right now, other than in the world of Amashik, I would have to say in the moments I get to spend with my daughter. I mentioned I'm a fitness coach, so I work early in the morning and then sometimes late at night. But the middle of my day, where most people are working that 9 to 5, at this point in time, I'm just spending time with my daughter, and that is an indescribable joy. So most certainly that's the answer.
It's amazing. Kids are the best.
They're the best.
Congratulations, you've defeated Thanos. You now have the Infinity Gauntlet in your possession.
Oh, no.
And you can snap your fingers and change any aspect of reality. What's the first thing you would do with it?
You would think that everybody has that answer, stocked and ready to go. I actually don't. Having to answer on the fly, what would I do? I'll give myself a little 10-second countdown here, and then I'll give you an answer.
It's okay. We can edit that down. You can take as much time as you need.
Yeah, because part of me, I don't want to use that as a soapbox to stand on, but it's almost, you kind of have to, right? That's what Thanos would do. I would snap my fingers, and we would all speak one language that none of us knew. So we'd have to learn a new language, but it's the only language we could speak. I don't know if I can do that with this gauntlet, but that's what I would do, because I think it would put us all in a space where we needed each other to communicate, and we needed to hear one another, and we needed to create space for everybody, because we're in this great unknown. So that's what I would say.
Interesting. So what's next for J.L. Johnson?
Immediately finishing arc 1 of Ennead the Rule of 9, which should be about, at this point, 7 to 8 weeks away. And then leaning into trying to get as many eyes as I can on arc 1. I always said that when I had arc 1 complete, there would be enough story for anybody to grab and decide what they felt about Ennead the Rule of 9. I'm trying to tell a large story, so I knew that I couldn't wait until it was all completed to really show the scope and the array of topics that I want to touch on and hint at some of these bigger themes. And so I knew I couldn't wait. So I did a lot of work in the beginning to at least hint at, or in some cases blatantly state, things that were important to me and that were going to be important in Ennead the Rule of 9. And so after arc 1 is complete, making sure that I can get that in as many hands as possible is priority number 1.
Well, JL, I just wanted to take the time to thank you for coming down to my humble little podcast to talk about your book. It's been so much fun.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation and the questions, and you definitely opened my mind up to some things that I hadn't thought about in those ways. Everything from the Batman utility belt to teaching as storytelling. So I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. This has been great. So where can people find you online?
The easiest place to find me would be on Twitter or Instagram, Ennead_comic on both of those platforms. And then beyond that, EnneadComic.com for my website, where you can join a mailing list and actually still email me for the time being, because my mailing list isn't that large, and I will answer you.
And now it's time to go. Wasn't that fun? The Panel Garden is a show about the things we love. It's produced and hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. Opening theme by Antonia Marquis and Tyler Scott. Closing theme by Mikey Flash of Speed Force Music. The credits are read by the awesome and talented Kat Bertano. That's me. And if you're feeling super generous, feel free to go to buymeacoffee.com/EvaIsAdorable. There, you can support what we do by chipping in as little as $1. Not financially able? That's okay. Shares on social media and reviews on your favorite podcast listening platforms help us a ton. And that's it, babies. That's all we got. Thank you for being awesome, valid, and perfectly gorgeous. We couldn't do this show without the love and support of the amazing people who listen. That's you. Join us next time for another death-defying adventure in cyberspace. Bye.